The GPS said he was at the office. I was parked on a residential street 40 minutes from our house, engines still running, hands in my lap, watching my husband push a little girl on a swing in the backyard of a house I had never seen before. She was maybe 4 years old. She had his ears, that specific shape, the way they sat a little low and rounded at the lobe. I used to trace them with my finger when he was sleeping and he didn't know I was awake. He was laughing. Full, open, head back laughing, the kind I hadn't heard from him in at least 2 years, maybe longer. I tried to remember the last time I'd heard him laugh like that, and I couldn't place it. I didn't honk. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't call him. I sat completely still, and I watched until the little girl got tired of swinging, and he scooped her up, and they went inside, and the back door closed behind them, and the yard went quiet. And then I looked at the garden along the fence, and I noticed it was full of tulips. I don't know exactly how long I stayed there after they went inside. Long enough that the light changed. Long enough that a neighbor walked a dog past my car and glanced at me the way people glance at parked cars they don't recognize. I kept my eyes on that backyard. The swing was one of those wooden A-frame sets, freshly painted dark green, no rust on the chains, the ground beneath it worn down in 2 neat patches where small feet had dragged. Someone had put real effort into that swing. That's the detail that lodged in me, even before the shock had fully arrived. Not the anger, not the nausea, not the specific cold that was starting to move up from my stomach, just that thought. He built that. He stood in that yard with a level and a drill, and he built a swing for that child. Or he paid someone to. And either way, he chose to. I drove home in total silence with my phone face down on the passenger seat and the radio off, and every traffic light feeling like it was holding me there on purpose, making me sit with it one red light longer. When he got home that night, he said the Henderson account had run long. Dinner meeting, he said. The clients always want to turn everything into a dinner. He smelled like garlic and something with lemon. He kissed me on the cheek, the way he always did. That quick press of lips that had become so automatic, I sometimes didn't register it until after he'd already moved away. He asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone with the particular blank look of someone winding down. I watched him. Not suspiciously, or not only suspiciously. I watched him the way you look at a word you've said so many times it stops looking like it's spelled right. I was searching for the seam, the place where the performance started. I couldn't find it. After 11 years together, 8 of them married, I could not locate a single crack in the surface of him. I went to bed before he did, and I lay there in the dark, replaying the image of him pushing that little girl on the swing. And I kept thinking, I found that house because of a loyalty card. That's all it was, a grocery store loyalty card. I should back up. We met in 2013 at a going-away party for a mutual friend named Pete who was moving to Vancouver for work. The party was at someone's apartment in the kind of neighborhood that hasn't been fully cleaned up yet. 3rd floor walk-up, everyone's standing with their drinks because there wasn't enough seating. Daniel was the one who stayed after to help clean up. I remember noticing that specifically. The way he just started collecting cups without being asked, without making a thing of it. I thought that said something real about him. We dated for 2 years, moved in together, got married in 2017 at my parents' backyard. Small ceremony, 20-some people, folding chairs on the grass. He said he didn't want the performance of a wedding, just the fact of the marriage. I found that romantic at the time. I still kind of do, actually, and I'm not sure what to do with that. We bought the house in 2018. 3 bedrooms, decent school district, more space than 2 people needed. I thought that was forward thinking. We didn't have kids yet, but I assumed we would. That assumption sat at the center of everything. We'd been trying to have a child for about 3 years before any of this happened. It wasn't working, and there wasn't a single clean reason why. Just the slow accumulation of failed cycles. One miscarriage at 11 weeks that we told almost no one about, and the specific kind of silence that fills a marriage when something you both want isn't happening and neither of you knows how to talk about the not happening of it. We'd stopped discussing it the way we used to. In the early days, we'd talked about it openly. Names, plans, which bedroom would be the nursery. Then the conversations got shorter. Then they became almost entirely logistical. Then they stopped, unless a doctor's appointment made them necessary. He threw himself into work. I threw myself into my job at the property management company where I'd been for 6 years. We had dinner together most nights. We watched TV. We were kind to each other, in the careful way of people who have agreed, without saying so, to protect something fragile. I thought we were just in a hard season. I genuinely believed that. I thought we were the kind of couple who went through difficult things and came out the other side, and that what we were doing was waiting for the other side to arrive. The loyalty card was from a grocery store. Not the one near our house, a different chain entirely, one that didn't have a location in our neighborhood. I found it in the center cup holder of Daniel's truck when I borrowed it one Saturday to pick up mulch from the garden center. My car was in the shop for a brake job that was taking longer than expected, and the truck was just sitting in the driveway. The card was sitting right there in the cup holder with some loose change and a parking receipt. It had a small sticker on the back with the member account information printed on it. The name was Claire Arnett. I turned it over in my hand for a moment, assumed it was a coworker's card that had ended up in his truck somehow, and put it in the glove box. I didn't think about it for 2 weeks. Then I was cleaning out the truck because Daniel had asked me to, something about needing it detailed for a client drive, and the card was still in the glove box. I picked it up again. Claire Arnett. I don't know what made me type it into Google. Boredom, maybe? Habit? Something that didn't have a name yet? That was the moment. Everything before it was just regular life. Claire Arnett had a Facebook profile set to semi-public. I could see her profile photo, a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair, standing on what looked like a hiking trail, squinting into the sun with an easy smile. Her cover photo was of a house with a garden, tulips along the fence. I didn't connect that immediately. I kept scrolling. She posted infrequently, mostly photos of a child she called my little bug, with the location tags removed. The child was maybe 3 or 4 in the photos. I scrolled back through the months without any particular feeling, just looking, the way you look at a stranger's profile with idle curiosity. Then I found a birthday party photo, her daughter's by the look of the balloons and the smeared cake. In the far right edge of the frame, almost entirely out of shot, was a man's forearm. Just the forearm, a hand resting on the back of a chair, and a watch. A Seiko, with a distinctive scratch across the crystal. I knew that scratch. Daniel had gotten it on a camping trip with his brother 4 years ago. He'd refused to have it repaired because he said the scratch reminded him of a good weekend. I closed the laptop and sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, telling myself I was wrong. I was not wrong. I did what I probably shouldn't have, and I did it carefully. I made a fake profile, just a first name, a stock photo of a woman I pulled from a free image site, a sparse but plausible-looking page, and I sent Claire a follow request. She accepted within a day. Her profile opened up. More photos, more context, more of her actual life. The little girl's name was Maisie. There were Christmas photos, Easter, a trip to a lake somewhere, birthday parties, a Halloween where Maisie was dressed as a ladybug. Daniel wasn't in any of them directly. Whoever was behind the camera had either avoided being in frame or been cropped out.
But if you knew what to look for, the signs accumulated. His truck visible in the driveway in 2 separate photos taken months apart. A coffee mug on the counter that I recognized, part of a ceramic set we'd received as a wedding gift, earthy tones with an uneven glaze. I'd thought we'd broken or lost all of those mugs years ago. Apparently not. He had taken one. He had been drinking his morning coffee in our wedding mug in another woman's kitchen. I wrote that in my notes in a document I password protected, and then I stared at the sentence for a long time before I kept going.
I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about that because people always say they would. Immediately, no hesitation, they would walk up to their spouse and put whatever they'd found on the table and demand an explanation right then. I didn't do that. I spent 2 weeks doing something that felt at the time like preparation, and that I now understand was also, in part, postponement. I pulled every bank statement I could access. His business expenses were largely handled through the company card, so his personal spending was limited, but the patterns were there if you looked closely. A recurring transfer to an account I didn't recognize. Not huge amounts, $400 some months, sometimes $6. Regular enough to be deliberate. I told myself it could be almost anything. A loan to a friend, a savings account he'd opened separately, a gambling issue he'd never told me about, which would have been bad but manageable in a way this was not. I kept building him exits in my head, reasons this wasn't what it looked like. And then I would pull up Claire's profile on the fake account and look at Maisie's dark hair and Daniel's specific ears, and the exits would close again. I was doing it anyway, though. Building the exits. That scared me when I noticed it. I found a phone glue. I know. I didn't know they still existed either. But there was one outside a car wash near the industrial part of town, the kind of area that still has a few relics of older infrastructure just because no one got around to removing them. I drove back to it. I called the number associated with the unknown bank account from that phone pay, standing on the concrete in the early afternoon with trucks moving on the road behind me. It rang 4 times. A woman answered. Her voice was neutral and a little tired, the specific tiredness of someone who'd just gotten a child down for a nap and was hoping for 20 minutes of quiet before the next thing. I said I had the wrong number. She said no problem and hung up. I stood there holding the receiver for another few seconds after the line went dead. I had been hoping for something that would close this down. An obviously wrong number, a different kind of voice, something that would let me file this under mistake and go home. The voice gave me nothing like that. It gave me only a real person on the other end of a real line. And I drove home in silence and made dinner and sat across from Daniel and watched him eat.
Here's what I learned over the following week from things I should not have accessed and will not detail completely. The bank account was in both their names. Daniel's middle name, which he never used professionally or socially, and Claire's. Maisie was 4 years old. I had to do the arithmetic twice because the first time I didn't want the answer I got. 4 years old meant that she had been conceived during the calendar year Daniel and I started fertility treatments. The year we sat in a doctor's office and were told there was no obvious clinical reason this wasn't working. Just keep trying, just give it more time. The house was a rental, not a purchase, but it was a real lease at a real address. The address I had driven to and parked in front of while watching him push his daughter on a swing he had built for her. He had a second phone. I found it taped with black electrical tape to the inside of the truck's wheel well, behind the spare tire. I did not turn it on. I sat in the driveway with it in my hand for a long time, just feeling the weight of it. It was ordinary. Just a cheap smartphone in a black case, the same weight and size as any other phone. That was somehow the worst part. I told one person, my sister Bia, who is 4 years older than me, and has a quality I have always relied on. She stays level when everything around her is collapsing. Not in a cold way, not detached, but grounded in a way that means she doesn't amplify panic, she absorbs it. I drove to her apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything in the order it had happened, starting with the loyalty card and ending with the second phone. She listened without interrupting. She didn't gasp or reach across the table. She just listened. And when I was done, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "How long do you want to know before you do something about it?" I didn't understand the question right away. She explained, carefully, that sometimes people sit with information and it changes them in ways they haven't fully tracked. Changes what they want, changes what they're willing to accept, changes the shape of whatever decision comes next. She said, "You might want to know who you are after you've lived with this for a while before you blow everything up." It was the most useful thing anyone said to me through the entire experience, and I hated how right it was. Here's what I learned over the following week from things I should not have accessed and will not detail completely. The bank account was in both their names. Daniel's middle name, which he never used professionally or socially, and Claire's. Maisie was 4 years old. I had to do the arithmetic twice because the first time I didn't want the answer I got. 4 years old meant that she had been conceived during the calendar year Daniel and I started fertility treatments. The year we sat in a doctor's office and were told there was no obvious clinical reason this wasn't working. Just keep trying, just give it more time. The house was a rental, not a purchase, but it was a real lease at a real address. The address I had driven to and parked in front of while watching him push his daughter on a swing he had built for her. He had a second phone. I found it taped with black electrical tape to the inside of the truck's wheel well, behind the spare tire. I did not turn it on. I sat in the driveway with it in my hand for a long time, just feeling the weight of it. It was ordinary. Just a cheap smartphone in a black case, the same weight and size as any other phone. That was somehow the worst part. I told one person, my sister Bia, who is 4 years older than me, and has a quality I have always relied on. She stays level when everything around her is collapsing. Not in a cold way, not detached, but grounded in a way that means she doesn't amplify panic, she absorbs it. I drove to her apartment on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything in the order it had happened, starting with the loyalty card and ending with the second phone. She listened without interrupting. She didn't gasp or reach across the table. She just listened. And when I was done, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "How long do you want to know before you do something about it?" I didn't understand the question right away. She explained, carefully, that sometimes people sit with information and it changes them in ways they haven't fully tracked. Changes what they want, changes what they're willing to accept, changes the shape of whatever decision comes next. She said, "You might want to know who you are after you've lived with this for a while before you blow everything up." It was the most useful thing anyone said to me through the entire experience, and I hated how right it was. 5 years meant the whole shape of what I had understood as our marriage was wrong. Not just a recent betrayal, not a lapse in judgment during the hard stretch. 5 years meant that it had been happening through our fertility treatments, through the miscarriage, through every conversation we'd had about what our future looked like. I stopped sleeping well. I'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning, completely alert, the way you are when your body decides sleep is a luxury it can't afford right now. I'd lie there and listen to Daniel breathe beside me, slow, even, unbothered, and I'd try to locate a feeling that made sense. What I kept finding was disorientation. Not even grief yet, or not primarily. More like the specific vertigo of discovering that the floor of a room you've lived in for years has been replaced with something that looks identical, but isn't. And you have been walking on it for 5 years without noticing. Every memory I had of our life together
was now a memory of a life that had a different shape than I thought it did. Every moment I'd spent trusting him was a moment spent trusting a version of him that had never been the complete version. All of those moments still happened. They were still real. They just meant something different now, and I hadn't been asked. The impossible part, and I've thought about this a great deal in the time since, the impossible part was not the betrayal itself, it was the coexistence, the fact that both versions of Daniel were real. He had built a swing set for a child he was hiding from me, and he had also sat with me through a miscarriage and held my hand and not said anything because there was nothing to say, and he understood that. Both of those things were true. He had transferred money to a separate account to support a second household, and he had also remembered 3 weeks ago that I had a difficult meeting with a tenant on Thursday and asked me how it went when I got home. Both true. He had kissed me on the cheek like a habit, like a gesture so old it had lost all its electricity, and somewhere across the city he had laughed with his full chest in a backyard with a child who had his ears. All of it true. Simultaneously true. I kept waiting for the new information to cancel out the old, the way a wrong note cancels the harmony of a chord. It didn't. They just stacked. They sat on top of each other and they refused to resolve. And I was the one who had to keep living inside the unresolved space of it, pretending every evening that I didn't. I made a decision I am not proud of. I want to be straightforward about that rather than narrate my way around it. I decided to meet Claire in person before I confronted Daniel. I told myself, and mostly believed, that the reason was informational, that I needed to understand what this situation was to her before I could understand what it meant for me, whether she was a knowing participant in a deception or a woman who had also, in her own way, been lied to. Those two things led to very different situations, and I thought knowing the difference mattered. That was the honest part of my reason. The other part, which I admitted to myself only later, was that I wanted to see her. I wanted to look at the person whose life had been running parallel to mine for 5 years and understand what I was actually dealing with. I found a work reason to be in her neighborhood, a property inspection at a rental unit 2 streets over, that I rescheduled from its original date to put myself in that area on a Thursday morning. I created a third fake profile. I messaged her and suggested we meet. She said yes. I want you to understand what I did there. I manufactured a reason to be in her neighborhood. I lied about who I was. I made a choice about what she was allowed to know and when. And I told myself it was necessary. We met at a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. She was already there when I arrived, at a corner table with Maisie on her lap, sharing a muffin. I want to be careful about how I describe Claire because I think there's a version of this story where she becomes a villain by proxy, and that's not what happened, and it's not fair to her. She was warm, naturally, unperformatively warm, the kind of person who makes immediate, comfortable eye contact and asks questions and actually listens to the answers. She was good with Maisie in the easy way of someone for whom parenting has become second nature, rather than a conscious effort. Maisie was quiet and observant, dark-haired, serious-faced, sitting on her mother's lap, eating pieces of blueberry muffin, and watching the room with these careful, dark eyes. At one point, she picked up a piece of muffin and reached across the table and placed it in front of me, like a small, unprompted gift. I thanked her, and she looked at me with complete seriousness and then looked away. Claire laughed and said, "She does that. She likes feeding people." We talked for 40 minutes. Claire didn't know who I was. She thought I was a stranger who had reached out online because we had mutual interests. I sat across from her and I let her believe that for 40 minutes. I almost told her twice. The first time was when she said, in a casual, almost offhand way, "He's good to us. He just has a lot going on. Work stuff, life stuff. He's trying to figure things out." Said it the way you say something you've told yourself so many times it has become a comfortable explanation. I sat with that. I knew what a lot going on was. I was part of what he had going on. I was the other thing he was trying to figure out. The second time was when Maisie reached across the table with the muffin piece. Something about that specific gesture, the uncalculated generosity of a 4-year-old who just wants to share what she has, hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I thought about saying it. I ran through the first sentences in my head, but I didn't. I ordered a second coffee I didn't drink, and I made pleasant conversation. And I said it was really nice to meet them, and I meant it, which made everything more complicated. I walked to my car and sat down, and I thought, I just did exactly what Daniel does. I decided what someone else was allowed to know. I decided when they were allowed to know it. I made that choice for her, for my own reasons, and I called it necessary. The only difference between what I did and what he did was 40 minutes. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. I had gone into that coffee shop believing I was gathering information, protecting myself, being strategic. I came out having recognized something I didn't want to recognize. The machinery of it, the internal justification, the way you tell yourself a story about why the deception is actually a form of care or caution or self-protection. I knew that machinery now from the inside. I had used it myself on a smaller scale for 40 minutes in a coffee shop in a neighborhood I had manufactured a reason to visit. Daniel had been using it for 5 years. The scale was different, the consequences were incomparable, but the mechanism was the same one. I sat in my car and I thought, I understand him better now, and I do not want to understand him better now. I wanted the clarity of being purely wronged. I wanted to be the one person in this situation with clean hands. And I had just spent 40 minutes choosing what a woman with a 4-year-old daughter was allowed to know about her own life. My hands were not entirely clean. They were not dirty, the way his were, but they weren't clean. I drove to the property inspection, and I did my job, and I went home, and I didn't say anything to Daniel that night either. I confronted him 4 days later. I hadn't planned the timing, or I had been planning it for weeks in the abstract, and then one ordinary evening, it just arrived. He was in the kitchen when I got home from work, standing at the counter looking at something on his laptop, a glass of water beside him. I put my bag down on the chair by the door, the way I always did. I took off my jacket, I walked into the kitchen, and I said his name in a tone I had never used with him before. Not loud, not sharp, just waited in a way that made him look up immediately. He closed the laptop. I told him I knew. I used specific words. Claire, Maisie, the address, the account with his middle name on it. I said them evenly, without raising my voice, the way you read coordinates off a map. I watched his face as I spoke. It did something I had never seen it do before and have not been able to fully describe since. It wasn't guilt exactly. Guilt has a kind of clenching quality, a defensive contraction. What I saw was something closer to the particular expression of a person who had been holding a door shut with their whole body for years, and the door has finally just gone. Part terror, part unmistakably relief. I did not know what to do with the relief part. I still don't. He didn't deny anything. He didn't try to minimize or redirect or ask how I knew. He sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, not at the table, directly on the kitchen floor, and he put his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for what felt like a long time. I stood at the counter and I waited. I had been preparing for an argument and I didn't have one to have. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but he hadn't made any sound. He said, "I didn't know how to end either of it." Not a justification, almost a statement of fact, like someone describing a structural problem they had been unable to solve. He said he had been trying to find a way to fix it for 2 years. I asked him what fixing it looked like to him. He didn't answer right away. When he tried, he talked around it, talked about the situation being complicated, about not wanting to hurt anyone, about time getting away from him. I listened and I waited for a specific thing. I waited for him to say he wanted to fix it by choosing me, by coming back fully to this marriage, by ending the other thing entirely. He did not say that. Not once in that entire conversation did he say that. I noticed. I kept noticing.
We didn't resolve anything that night, or any night after that. He slept in the spare room. I lay in our bed, in the dark, in the house we had bought together in a school district I had thought was forward-thinking. And what I felt most was tired. Not shattered. Not in the kind of acute pain I had been bracing for all those weeks. Just deeply structurally exhausted. The way you are when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and it has finally been set down. My arms still remembered the weight of it. In the morning, I called a divorce attorney whose number I had saved in my phone 6 weeks earlier. At some point during the document I'd been building, in a moment of quiet clarity I hadn't let myself fully acknowledge. Her name was Robin. She was efficient, practical, not unkind. She said exactly what needed to be said in the initial consultation and nothing more. She didn't offer me sympathy or treat me like someone who needed managing. She just laid out what the process looked like and what it would require from me. I appreciated that more than I can explain. I needed someone who treated me like a person who was going to be fine and was simply taking the next practical step. That's what she did. The legal process took 8 months. That part of the story, the part that actually constitutes most of the time I spent going through this, is the part no one tells you about, because it's unglamorous and slow and requires an enormous amount of administrative attention at a time when administrative attention is the last thing you want to spend your energy on. Asset division, account separation, signed statements, 3-way calls with lawyers about whose name was on what and when. The house took the longest. We'd bought it together, both names on the mortgage, and working out the buyout required appraisals and negotiations and more conversations with Daniel over email than I would have preferred. He was cooperative throughout. Not warm, not what I would have called remorseful exactly, but cooperative. The kind of compliance that comes from knowing you have no moral standing to be otherwise. He moved out in month 3 into a rental. I learned later from Bia, who heard it from a mutual friend, that the rental was near Claire's neighborhood. I asked Bia not to give me updates after that. I needed to stop orienting myself by where he was. That had been the problem all along, in a way. I had been tracking his geography when I should have been paying attention to something else entirely.
What I hadn't anticipated was Claire. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, or 3 months after I'd moved most of my attention elsewhere, at least, I got a message on the fake profile I'd used to connect with her. I'd largely forgotten that profile existed. I opened the message and it said, simply, "I think you know Daniel. I think you might be his wife." I stared at it for a long time. I don't know how she figured it out. She never told me exactly. Something must have surfaced. Maybe Daniel said something. Maybe she noticed a detail I'd left visible. Maybe she's just perceptive in a way I underestimated. I didn't respond for a week. I sat with it the way B had told me to sit with things. let it change the shape of what I knew before I decided what to do about it. Then I responded. I told her my real name. I told her I was Daniel's wife and that we were divorced. I told her I had met her in that coffee shop knowing who she was, and I told her why, and I told her about the fake profiles and the bank account and the second phone and the timeline I'd pieced together. I sent it, and then I closed my laptop and went for a long walk and didn't check for a response for 2 days. Claire and I exchanged long messages over the following 2 weeks. Not many, maybe 5 or 6 each, but substantial ones, the kind that take time to write and arrive back hours or a day later considered. She was not angry at me, which I had expected and braced for. She was, I think, past the point of having surprise left in her. She directed her anger at Daniel, which was accurate and proportionate. She told me she had had suspicions for over a year, that things hadn't added up in ways she'd noticed but hadn't been ready to pull on. She said, I needed to be ready before I could know. I understood that sentence completely. She said she had ended things with Daniel about 2 months after I had, and the thing she said about why has stayed with me. She said, I don't want Maisie to grow up watching me accept something I told her she should never accept. I didn't write back immediately. I sat with that for a while, turning it over. I felt, in a complicated way, sad for all of it. For Claire, for Maisie, for the version of Daniel I had married, for whatever version of him was left after all of this, and a smaller, quieter sadness for myself, for the 3-bedroom house in the good school district and the nursery that never got used, and the years I spent thinking I was being patient when maybe I was just being unaware.
I still work at the same company. I have been offered a position with more travel, more responsibility that I turned down 2 years ago because Daniel didn't love the idea of me being away more. I took it this time. I still live in the same house. I bought him out. His name came off the deed, and I repainted the bedroom a color I would never have chosen when I was trying to make shared decisions. I moved the furniture around, bought a different bed frame, changed small things that added up to something that felt like mine in a way the house never entirely had. The 3-bedroom layout used to feel like a statement of intent, the implied future of children who would need space. And now it's just space, which is either sad or simply practical depending on the day you ask me. Some days I think about the nursery and feel the specific weight of what that room was for. Other days, I put my work things in it and leave the door open and don't think about it at all. The house is mine. That's not nothing. I didn't expect to find anything good in the aftermath, and that was something good, actually. Small and real and entirely mine. Bia asked me not long ago whether I was angry. We were at her apartment. Same kitchen table where I'd sat the first time I told her everything. Same mugs. I thought about it seriously before answering, the way the question deserved. The honest answer is not in the way I expected to be. Not the hot, constant kind. What I have now is something different, something closer to clarity about myself, which cost more than I would have budgeted for it, but arrived nonetheless. I understand things about how I function under fear that I didn't know before. I know that when I'm afraid of what I'll find, I build exits, reasons the bad thing might not be true, and I will keep building them with real industry until I absolutely cannot anymore. I spent 6 weeks constructing an elaborate case while also the entire time protecting him from its conclusions. I thought I was being careful and thorough. I was also being terrified. Those 2 things ran side by side the whole time, and I didn't name the second one until it was over. That's the thing I want to hold on to. Not the story of what he did, but the story of what I learned about how I work. Because he is not part of my life anymore. That version of me still is.
I keep coming back to the tulips. I've thought about them so many times in the years since that they've started to feel less like a memory and more like a symbol. Except I resist that framing because symbols are too tidy and this situation was never tidy. But I think about them specifically, the particular kind of attention they represent. Tulips aren't a low-effort gardening choice. You don't throw tulip bulbs in the ground and forget about them. You plant them in the fall, in cold soil, before the season has turned. You do it knowing that the result won't come for months, that you won't see end evidence of it through the winter. You have to be thinking ahead. You have to be planning to stay. Daniel planted those bulbs in the fall, which means he was standing in that yard in October or November, pushing a trowel into the ground, thinking about spring in a house 40 minutes from ours, while we were still married, while we were going to doctor's appointments and talking in our careful way about what our future was going to look like. He was thinking about spring in two places at once. He was planting two futures at the same time in two different soils and tending both of them, and I had been standing in one garden the entire time without knowing there was another. I don't know how a person does that. I've stopped trying to understand it. I'm not going to tell you the story ends with some clean lesson that made everything make sense. I know that's what these stories are supposed to deliver. The realization that reframes the pain, the moment you understand what you were meant to learn, the sense that the suffering had a point. I don't have that. What I have is a Tuesday, a regular Tuesday life that I built back from scratch, piece by piece, in the correct and unheroic way that real rebuilding works. Slowly, practically, without revelation. Some days it feels like enough. Most days, actually. Some days I drive past a garden center in October and see the tulip bulb displays stacked near the entrance. And I think about a backyard 40 minutes from where I live, and a swing I'll never see again, and a little girl who placed a piece of muffin in front of me like a gift and then looked away. And I keep driving. What I know now that I didn't know before is this. The version of someone you live beside and the version they are in the hours you cannot see are not always the same person. And when you find out they aren't, when the gap opens up and you have to stand at the edge of it and decide what you're going to do on the other side of knowing, that's the only part of any of this that was ever actually mine.